So all of that brings us to the next point, number 10. Which PEMF product works best, and how can we tell the difference between the products? Well, there's a huge problem with this. It's not as easy as you think, because most published specifications for PEMF products, all the different manufacturers, when I get my hands on one of these things, I can actually measure it using calibrated, traceable laboratory equipment to measure magnetic fields and frequencies and stuff. And I find that very often what they say they're doing is off by a factor of 10 or in some cases 100 or more from what they say their device does. So some of them say, oh, it puts out this many Gauss, but I mean, how many people are going to test that? Well, I will, right? But your average person doesn't own a Gauss meter, and they certainly don't own a high-speed Gauss meter, so they can test the change in the magnetic field very rapidly over time. So these guys, nobody's going to call them out on it for the most part. They can say whatever they want to say, and that's what they sell. And there's no standards in PEMF. There's no governing body that says, hey, you are or are not, publishing, product specifications that are accurate. And so it's kind of like the Wild West in PEMF marketing. So the problem is you can't really rely on what the marketers tell you, because the numbers they do tell you are wrong, and they also oftentimes don't tell you the correct numbers. Going back to the last slide where I said, I believe, based on the experiments I've done and what I've read in the scientific literature, that the key parameters for PEMF are the rate of change in the magnetic field, dB/dt, and the duration over which that change is maintained, time period of the induced pulse. And neither of those two parameters are reported by any of the PEMF companies. There's one or two that do, and they're really good quality things. They're very expensive, and they've been around for a while, but most of the commercial ones that you find now, even the really expensive ones, they just simply don't report that. Partly it's because they don't know. Oftentimes these devices are built by people who are marketers or not engineers, and if engineers are involved in this, there's sort of some guy that works in the back room. They're kind of a professional commodity, right? One engineer is the same as the other, and if you tell them make it 10 hertz and 1,000 Gauss, they'll make it 10 hertz and 1,000 Gauss without respect to even thinking about these key parameters, dB/dt, and the time period over which dB/dt is maintained. So you cannot directly compare based on anything that's published by the manufacturers. You can't directly compare one PEMF system to another, I think. At least you can't do it intelligently. But they do work differently, and what's the best way to tell? Well, even as a scientist, I would say, well, we can't base it on the literature, and unless you buy these things and measure them, you can't really compare their specs. But people are way too much into comparing the specs of a PEMF device and not really trying to compare the clinical observations. So I think the best way to find a good PEMF system is simply to find one that's highly reputable in a diverse clinical population. So I would say the questions you should ask are, asking clinicians, which PEMF systems have you used and which ones seem to help people the most? Do you know a clinician who has an opinion you can trust? And have you seen clinical outcomes yourself firsthand if you're a clinician? And if all of these things are true, if you have access to this information, that would be the information that I would rely upon. I wouldn't rely upon some arcane calculations. I mean, as a scientist, I do. That's what I'm trying to work on. But if I were trying to just use PEMF to help people, I would focus on what seems to be helping people. I wouldn't focus on a bunch of math that I don't understand and a bunch of theories that may or may not be right, and a bunch of published performance specs that are almost certainly exaggerated or just deeply inaccurate. So a lot of people want me to say, give them an answer that's cut and dried, black and white. This one works, this one doesn't. This one works, this other one doesn't for PEMF products. And I won't do that because I can't do that. Because what people are getting at is, if there are many PEMF products that work, how do you decide between them? If there's only one that works and the rest of them don't work, then it's easy. You go, if these all don't work and this one works. And when you talk to a marketer, it's a pretty safe bet. They will tell you all the competition doesn't work, but theirs does work because they have some secret sauce, some kind of secret frequency that's in theirs, and you've got to pay the money to get it. So I don't think there's any truth to that. I actually, based on thousands of discussions with people and clinicians and scientists, I would say there's a lot of different commercial PEMF systems that work. You can look at this a couple of different ways, which I will in a moment, but a lot of them work really pretty well. It's kind of surprising how, even though it's unregulated, it seems to be the the market has kind of regulated it. The vast majority of PEMF systems that are out there seem to actually work pretty well. The question is, are you getting the value that you want to get for the money that you're paying? That's really the question. So you can break this question down in two ways. Which individual brand is best? So which company do you want to buy a PEMF system from? And that's kind of, I think that comes down to not just a question of does their PEMF system work. It kind of comes down to a question of what kind of company is it? Are they going to give you knowledgeable, accurate after-sale support? Some of these companies, they will be your best buddy until you buy something. And once you've written a check, they don't pick up the phone anymore. They won't help you. They won't give you any advice. And I get many calls and many emails from people who say, I own a brand X and I can't figure out how to use it, and they won't answer my emails and phone calls anymore. Will you please tell me how to use it? It's kind of sad. I mean, sometimes these people are out $15,000, $20,000, $30,000 and I can't really help them. Usually it's $5,000 or $6,000 for those types of machines in that range. And I can't really help them because I'm not knowledgeable about the details of how to, and I can't give clinical advice. So it's hard to say which brand is best, but I would harken back to what I was saying in the last slide, which is I would buy one from a company that comes highly recommended by a lot of people as a company that makes both a good product and also provides excellent after-sale support. So I'd be shopping more for a good company than the best PEMF system. But the other thing you can consider is whole body versus focal, small area PEMF. And if you're asking, question number one, which brand is best, you can't really base it on the PEMF literature because it's not regulated, it's not standardized, and it's highly inaccurate. What matters most is reliable clinical observations and the quality of the company. Okay, but if you're looking at question number two, is it better to use a large whole body machine versus a small focal portable machine? I was actually surprised by this because I thought it would come out pretty strongly in favor of one or the other. But when I talked to many clinicians, and there's over maybe 150 clinicians I've talked to about this specific issue, really in a focused way, the answer seems to be that a combination of the two is best. So what seems to give the best long-term clinical outcome for people when they have a really severe problem and they are responsive, the problem's responsive to PEMF, what seems to be the best thing is for people to go to a knowledgeable clinic where they have a large, powerful system and they get a course of treatment, which might be 1 or 2 or 3 treatments a week for a certain number of weeks. But then they go home and they have personal PEMF that is a much lower dose device that is applying effective PEMF, but at a very low dose for a very long period of time, hours and hours every day. And so if you do this combination of effects, right, with a single large system combined with these clinical system, which is very expensive, out of reach for most people, it costs as much or more than a car sometimes. With the smaller portable systems that people can afford and they can use in their home, the combination of those two things seems to actually have the best short-term and long-term clinical outcome, according to many clinicians that I've spoken with. So if you're trying to decide between one or the other, you should consider the fact that both work pretty well. Now, I don't like to make in my technology, I'm focusing more on the really affordable personal ones, and I think that most people can get by with a smaller one. I think it's at least 80 or 90% of people don't need a whole body treatment. That's actually, they need to focus the treatment on the area that's causing the problem. But that requires, clinical insight and taking a medical history and finding out what injury a person may have had. It could have been decades ago that really needs to be treated well, that's grown to the point where that injury is causing a systemic problem. And then you can treat it with focal PEMF, and probably 80 to 90% of the time that really does help most people. But there are benefits to using these larger systems, which I don't make. But then there's a third kind of system, which actually I've just recently introduced, which is a Model C5, which actually has 4 different outputs. So you can actually use focal treatment, but you can build it into a larger area and treat sort of a large area. Or you can put the pads in different locations, like you could treat one of your feet, one of your hips, your shoulder, and your hand at the same time with a focused treatment. So it can treat up to 4 areas, which I think is more useful for people than whole body machines. And one of the reasons I think it's more useful than these whole body machines, there's 2 reasons. One of them is whole body machines are not really flexible in how you place the magnetic field and the orientation of the field lines. The other thing is that a lot of PEMF machines are sold as whole body machines when in fact the actual active area of their coil is maybe only 5 or 6 or 7 inches in diameter. So even though it's a big pad that you lay down on and they call it whole body, there's no widely accepted definition for what whole body is. Does that mean it's equally doing the top of your head and the bottom of your feet and everything in between, or it's doing some area on your body? These things aren't really defined very well, and people ask questions. Well, how far away from the mat does the field penetrate? Well, the field kind of tapers off as like an inverse cube. 1 over the distance cubed is pretty standard for like a solenoid drop off on axis. So that doesn't really matter so much as whether or not it's effective over a certain distance. You don't really care how far the field goes. You want to know within that extent of the field what's the range over which there's a beneficial therapeutic effect. And I have taken apart and I've looked at and I'm privy to the designs of some of these things, and some of them have really big coils, but the fields are really only sort of in a donut shape around where the coils are, and in the middle there's really nothing much going on. Other big whole body PEMF systems will have a large mat but actually has just 1 or 2 small effective areas, and they call them whole body. And I would argue that those are not whole body systems. I would argue that those are sold and marketed as whole body systems, but maybe not so much. And so really, even in that case, you're seeing that with just a focal treatment you're getting broader systemic benefit than you would get with other modes of treatment, even if the PEMF treatment is small and localized, which I think is more often than not that's the case with some of these whole body systems. So you do have to be kind of careful, but setting aside all the sort of engineering technical details, when I talk to clinicians who really focus on this and they really want to say what's best for people, generally they say both: big system, several treatments or a course of treatment a few times a week, plus something that people can take home and use every day. And that seems to be best. This brings us to topic number 12. Can PEMF be used with other treatments, devices, etc.? And I am of the opinion, I didn't start this way, but the evidence seems pretty strong that PEMF is perhaps the ultimate adjunct therapy. I've talked to thousands of people, and a couple, maybe 150 or 160 of them so far, are clinicians who do other types of therapy and combine it with PEMF or other things. And initially I was quite concerned. Don't want to start combining things because you might hurt somebody with some sort of unseen interaction that might not be beneficial. But many clinicians combine PEMF with other treatments, both mainstream and alternative, and they uniformly tell me that if you use PEMF with any of their main treatments, that it makes the outcome better. And this is true for chiropractic, nutritional interventions, naturopathy, acupuncture, laser and LED therapy, stem cell therapy, post-surgical recovery, even treatments for secondary effects of radiation and chemo. These things seem to be better if you apply PEMF of some effective kind as an adjunct. And it seems logical really now, thinking that there are no known adverse interactions or reactions of PEMF when used properly with any other intervention. Nothing that I've ever seen, nothing that I've ever been able to find, and I've looked. Nothing that anybody's ever reported to me has been an adverse interaction. So PEMF is a logical candidate, but why should it be so helpful to so many other things? And my hypothesis for this is that these medical interventions that people are using should work, but they can be inhibited. Their effectiveness can be inhibited by a chronic pathologic inflammatory state. And based on not just the hypothesis, but the experiments that we've done to show that that chronic inflammatory state is reduced, it would then allow the very same other medical intervention, whether it's exercise or any other alternative or mainstream treatment, to actually work the way it's supposed to work on that tissue, because a tacit assumption in a lot of these therapies is that, well, tissue should respond a certain way to certain nutrients or some sort of signal of some kind, some sort of therapy. But if the tissue itself is pathologic because of this chronic inflammatory state, it can't really do that. So your interventions, although they would be correct, they're unable to overcome this inflammatory barrier. So if you reduce that chronic pathologic inflammatory barrier, what you see is that all of these other treatments actually work the way they're supposed to. And I've had many clinicians tell me, wow, things are working the way they tell me they're supposed to work, or that I learned they were supposed to work from a textbook or from my training. They work the way that they logically should work now. So the interventions themselves are great, but they need a little bit of help to suppress this inflammatory barrier. Anyway, that's my hypothesis on why PEMF is so broadly helpful, because it just does one thing really well. It reduces this chronic pathologic inflammatory state so that everything else can work the way it's supposed to, and that's both your cells and tissues as well as some of these clinical interventions. And the final talk of my slide, what is the future of PEMF? I think it's very bright. Despite a century of being suppressed by bad policy and fear and stigmatization and bad science, I think scientific PEMF research has recently seen a resurgence, especially in the last 10 years or so. Partly, I think this is being driven by clinical demand for it, because uniquely PEMF seems to address underlying causes of pain and dysfunction. It seems to ameliorate symptoms, sure, but the effects are much more fundamental and long-lasting than just blocking pain signals or treating symptoms. So PEMF seems to be doing something more fundamental and much more important than most of the sort of superficial symptom-based treatments that we have in the mainstream. One of the biggest impediments to PEMF really taking off is actually self-inflicted by the PEMF community. And this is the integrity of the PEMF marketplace, which right now I think is pretty sketchy. I mean, there's great people out there who I know and I like them. They're my colleagues, and there are many other people who are, it's basically fraud and hype and bias and misinformation. And these things, it helps them get a quick buck and make a sale, but the long-term effects are that it's just another thing people who are disbelievers and mainstream, who are skeptics, can point at and say, see, look at what this guy claimed, with their PEMF device, and look at these mystical claims and these unreasonable things, and it just undermines the whole thing. It lowers the respectability of the entire field when people just try to turn a quick buck that way. But the opportunities for PEMF are great. For example, I think there's a huge opportunity to supplant, completely replace mainstream harmful standards of care and standard treatments. For example, if chronic pain, as you can see in the pie graph here, is larger than pretty much all other medical markets combined. It's like 100 million people in the United States. The cost of chronic pain is phenomenally huge. It's something like, it's estimated by painmed.org. Chronic pain supposedly costs the United States about $660 billion with a B, dollars every year, just in lost work, not to mention all the other associated costs. And that's about the size of the defense budget. That's about 3% of the GDP of the United States is lost due to chronic pain, and we don't have any good treatments for it, as are evidenced by failed back syndrome, where 85% of people are worse off after back surgery after 2 years than they would have been if they didn't have surgery. The opioid crisis, and there are many untreatable diseases of aging that are complicated by chronic pain, that just are so, they're so bad, but they're so prevalent, we just take them as a normal part of aging. We don't reject them as maybe we should, as something that can be treated and dealt with effectively by something like PEMF. So I think there's a great opportunity in the marketplace. There's a great social opportunity. I think the potential is really built up. We just have to do the right things in the PEMF community to bring this forward to people. And that's like my professional mission, is to try to forward the benefits of PEMF and try to bring as much integrity as possible to the research and as well as the marketing and the sort of popular explanation of what's going on. So a certain amount of that is getting people to be scientifically literate enough to see and understand, scams when they hear them, right? And also for PEMF, accessibility is essential. I mean, these things have to be affordable. Right now, you've got these $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 PEMF devices, and I can tell you as an engineer, there's not $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 worth of stuff in there. Some of these are the size of, carry-on luggage, but they don't have to be. I think they can be smaller, they can be simpler. That's what my technology is driving towards. They certainly don't have to be tens of thousands of dollars. I'm able to sell products that are viewed by clinicians as equivalently effective to large devices for 1% or less of the cost of some of the larger PEMF devices. So it can be done. I'm certainly not the greatest engineer in the world, and I'm certainly not the best product engineer. So eventually there's going to be some really smart people that come along, pick this up and carry it across the finish line, and you'll be able to pick up an extremely effective PEMF system from any drugstore anywhere. And when that happens, I'll be delighted, because my goal is to make PEMF available to everyone so that our children and our grandchildren can benefit, because they need it. And in an environment that has more and more chronic disease and more disability and more untreatable problems as these things emerge, as people get older, these problems, there's just more prevalence of diseases of old age when there's more old people. So we need to have PEMF that is affordable, it's available, there are trained and knowledgeable clinicians, but then there's also people just generally who need to use it, who are scientifically literate enough and intelligent enough to be able to follow simple directions and use these devices. And so I think this is all these sort of things that I'm pushing for PEMF, and I'm very, very hopeful, and I'm optimistic that things are going to turn in the direction where PEMF becomes embraced, widespread. I think there's no holding it back, because when you it's the truth will out, and when you really see what PEMF can do for such a wide range of problems that have no other treatment alternatives, any intelligent person will eventually have to just say, okay, there must be something to it. And when you take into consideration the fact that it just doesn't seem to be harmful, and it can be small and simple and affordable, it's difficult for me to imagine how a truth like that could be suppressed for very much longer. So anyway, I think the future of PEMF is very bright. I'm very optimistic, and I hope the information in this talk was helpful to you. This was a very long, detailed version of a talk that I just finished a few minutes ago, actually, by Skype at a conference, 500, 600 miles from here. But there were many other things I wanted to say. So this is the long version that has all the information in it that I wanted to make available to people. I'll put it up and I'll allow comments. And if somebody asks me for more information or links, I'll actually try to put links in down below here in YouTube, so that you can find more information. I'll try to make this something that people can comment on, watch, and get as much useful information with useful scientific links and connections as possible. Thanks.